Right. So I sort of admiring the imagery. It is my pleasure.
Something about 1 second.
Oh, apparently I'll just waffle for a bit because there's a technical problem. Anybody's got any preferences what I waffle about? The update on the gender neutral toilet. So the gender neutral toilet is closed. So there's a women's toilet across the room. But I don't know about men. Men have to find their own way around the building and go on a little hunt. They can share their findings. Margarida, does it work?
Yeah, I think
Okay,
so.
it just has a weird vibe. Okay,
Yeah,
then it is my great pleasure to welcome Margarida Hermida. It's going to talk about pregnancies, containment, and parthood, and is already front runner in the best PowerPoint imagery competition that is running, by the way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If you see something there saying, please remove this window, just ignore that. So I'm going to talk about pregnancy as containment and parthood, and I'm hoping I will help contribute to the debate in a productive way and not trivialize it. And I want to point out that this is partly based on joint work with James Ladyman as we developed the living objects view of organisms. And now it's not working anymore. Oh, come on. It was working just now.
Did you click on it?
I clicked on it since. No, I hadn't clicked on it. Okay, right. Right, so here's a brief outline of what I'm going to do. And let's get straight into it. So I'm going to try and skip the bits about terminology. I just want to note that I will just use developing organism, foster, and fetus interchangeably, and the same for gravida, gestator, pregnant organism, and maternal organism. Try not to read too much into that. So pregnancy is a kind of viviparity. So in viviparous species, what happens is that development of a multicellular organism takes place inside an organism of the same species. And it can be associated with different kinds of nutritional provisioning. So the ancestral state is oviparous lecitotrophy. I'm not sure how to say that, which is egg laying. And then in species that have internal fertilization and egg retention, those are viviparous, and the ancestral state of that is viviparous lecitotrophy, which means that the eggs are retained inside the maternal organism, but all the nutritional needs of the developing embryo are taken care of by the nutrients already present in the egg. And then some lineages, some viviparous lineages have developed some specific kinds of nutritional provisioning where the maternal organism directly provides some kind of nutrition for the developing organism. And in some cases, this is in the form of a placenta, which is a specialized structure for physiological exchange between the maternal organism and the fetus. So I don't know if this is going to work, but I'll try. That's so I just wanted to show you, so this is a shark giving birth. And what I wanted you to notice, did you see that? The placenta and umbilical cord. So it's actually not just eutherian mammals that have placentas. There are some sharks that do too, which I think is pretty cool. Sorry? Yes, exactly. Okay. How do I get out of here? Sorry, I got stuck here now. Yeah, I have clicked escape, but it's not moving forward. What do I do now? Help. Yeah. I tried escape by clicking, I tried unclicking. The one after the sharks. So then this one. Oh. That one.
Might want to put it on the plate or whatever.
Sorry about that. I should not include videos. Whenever I include videos, it doesn't go well.
There you go.
Okay. Yeah, it's working. Okay, so in eutherian mammals and not just in eutherian mammals, pregnancy involves this close physiological connection between the developing organism and the gestator through the placenta and umbilical cord. And this raises not only the question of when the developing organism comes into existence, but also the question of what is the nature of this relationship between the gestator and the developing organism. So the two questions are separate. I'm going to start by addressing the Parthood question. So on the containment view, the fetus is not a part of the pregnant organism. It's merely contained within it or surrounded by it. I'll try to be quick on this bit. So like a tub of yogurt in your refrigerator. The idea is that the foster occupies a niche within the interior of the mother, in the same way that something might be lodged in your digestive tract. And note that Smith and Brogard think that the digestive tract is not part of the organism. Or sorry, it's not, the interior of the digestive tract is not part of the internal environment of the organism. Or in the same way that a kangaroo joey is lodged inside its mother's pouch. And right there you can see a huge difference because the joey can get out of the pouch and come back in. So Smith and Brogard argue that the foster is not part of the gravida because firstly, it has its own external boundary, which is a bona fide boundary, a genuine physical discontinuity that separates it from the gravida. It's surrounded by the amniotic cavity, and the two are not strictly topologically connected. Now, according to the Parthood view, the fetus is a part of the maternal organism. And the reason is that if we look at physiology, Kingma argues, it turns out that fosters do not meet any of Smith and Brogard's own criteria for being a tenant in a niche. And that's because Kingma argues that the boundary between foster and gravida is not a bona fide boundary, but a fiat boundary, so not a real physical discontinuity. The amniotic cavity only partly surrounds the foster, but it is actually topologically connected to the maternal organism via a stalk, which is similar to internal organs. And of course, like I already said, it cannot move into and out of the maternal organism. And in fact, even if it were possible for fetuses to be transplanted from one pregnant organism to another, that would be analogous to and equally as hard as transplanting an organ, and not analogous to getting a tub of yogurt out of the fridge. So even though the question of coming into existence, when the organism comes into existence, is a separate one, it is true that the containment view tends to be associated with an early organismality view. So, for example, Smith and Brogard argue that the human organism begins to exist around 16 days post-conception, around the time of gastrulation, where they argue the foster ceases to be a cluster of homogeneous cells and is transformed into a single heterogeneous entity, a whole multicellular living being. Whereas the Parthood view is compatible with the developing organism only coming into existence at birth, or it's also compatible with its coming into existence much earlier, in fact, at any time during development. But if the developing organism does begin to exist before birth, then on the Parthood view, we have to allow that organisms can be part of other organisms, and in fact, they can be part of other organisms of the same species. Now, why is that a problem? Well, the idea is that organism is supposed to be a substance sortal, which is a natural kind term that refers to a thing that is countable and has some specific persistence conditions. That's the general idea of a sortal, and in particular, a substance sortal. And it's generally thought that sortals, or at least substance sortals, obey this mereological principle that says that if an object belongs to a certain sortal, then no proper part of it also belongs to that same sortal. But in fact, this mereological principle is not essential for the concept of a sortal, which can be defined purely by the counting and persistence conditions. But does having organisms as other parts imply or create some counting problems? Because that is essential to sortals. Kingma thinks so, and she's not alone. So David Wiggins says of the Pope's crown that is composed of 3 crowns, he says that there's no definite answer when the Pope is wearing his crown to the question, how many crowns does he have on his head? And Kingma argues that if Wiggins is right about crowns, then the same problem is going to apply to pregnant organisms. If you point to a pregnant organism, there is no definitive answer to the question, how many organisms are there? Well, I think that, in fact, counting does not at all depend on the mereological principle. And I'm not sure that any counting problems arise. So how many crowns are there? Well, 4. There's one that is the Pope's crown, and it's made of 3 crowns. So 4. No counting problem. Pregnant organism. How many organisms are there? 2. There's one organism that is pregnant and contains another one as a part. Not particularly hard to count. Okay, so now I'm going to propose my theory of organisms, the living objects view. So Eric Olson points out that in discussions of organismality, or as he calls it, biological individuality, people do not address what he calls the composition problem. So they discuss definitions of what it is for something to be an organism without discussing what things are there that might be organisms or not. And he thinks that that might be, so he thinks that that is a problem unless people are generally assuming some unrestricted account of composition, where anything that anyone could possibly take to be an organism exists, and then you only have to decide whether or not it's an organism. And he argues that, well, actually, this is the wrong way to go about things. We should first have an account of what candidate things there are before we can know which ones are organisms. And so, and here I agree with Chris, we need an account of composition. And I think that we need an account of composition before, or within our account of organismality. So an account of composition is an answer to Van Inwagen's special composition question: when do some things compose something else? And some popular views in the literature are nihilism. Things never compose something else. Composition never occurs. Universalism or unrestricted composition. Any random assemblage of things composes an object. So me and that thing over there and an atom on the moon compose an object. And then Chris also already talked about Van Inwagen's own view is that some things compose something if their activities constitute a life. I call it the life view because I don't like to call it organicism because that's confusing because it means something else. Anyway, now I don't think that any of these are satisfying answers to the special composition question, because none of them appropriately distinguishes things that are objects according to science or common sense from things that are not objects according to either science or common sense. And so I think that what is needed is a naturalistic answer to the special composition question that will, as much as possible, be aligned with what science says there is, and also ideally with common sense. And I think that the bound state view is just that. So the bound state view involves the physical notion of a bound state, which has to do with the energy of the particles that compose something. So Vector and Ladyman say that in order to compose something at T, physical objects must form a connected plurality under the relation of forming a bound state. Now, roughly what this means is that two or more objects are in a bound state if they're confined to a common region of space due to some physical force that is holding them together, such that it would require an input of energy to separate them. That's the general notion of bound state. Now, here is our official answer to the special composition question. Some things compose something at T if and only if the X's form a connected chain of bound states composed of pairs or higher pluralities of the X's, such that the binding energy holding together a physical system composed of all and only the X's is greater than the binding energy holding together a physical system composed of the X's plus any other objects. This requires three notions. The notion of a bound state. So the X's are in a bound state if and only if each of the X's lies within a bounded region of space and has a lower total energy than the potential energy it would have if it were to lie outside of that region of space. The X's form a connected chain of bound states if all the X's are either directly or indirectly bound to each other via a series of elementary bound states. And then the binding energy of a physical system is just the minimum amount of energy that would need to be supplied to the system in order for them to cease to form a connected chain of bound states. Don't worry too much about the details. Now, a really cool thing about this view is that composite objects can sometimes also compose other composite objects, which is precisely what we want, because that's what we do think happens. So when does this happen? Well, consider an object that is composed of the X's, and now consider a subset of the X's, the Z's. This subset of the X's, the Z's, forms itself a composite object if it forms a connected chain of bound states such that the binding energy holding them together is higher than the binding energy holding together the Z's plus some other objects like some other X's. So now we have a view of composition and we can address the question of what is an organism. And the view couldn't be any simpler. Organisms are living physical objects. composite objects, to be precise, living composite objects. What composite physical objects are there? That is given by the bound state view of composition. Now, which ones are alive? That I think is given by a metabolic view of life. So on this metabolic view of life, already Y is alive if Y is confined to a physical space surrounded by and including a physical boundary, and has the capacity to engage in metabolic activities involving the selective exchange of matter with the environment across at least part of the boundary, and the acquisition of free energy to maintain itself in a stable state of thermodynamic disequilibrium. So something that fits these two conditions is an organism. So the parts of the boundary form a connected chain of bound states with the various components of the organism that are contained inside it. The boundary is essential to the existence of a living object, and it demarcates it from the environment. And so an organism is composed of the parts of the boundary and all and only the objects that are both contained within the boundary and form a connected chain of bound states with its parts. Why do I have two conditions here? Actually, in most cases, containment is a form of bound state. So when some things are contained inside an object, like a membrane or some other boundary, they're unable to escape due to electromagnetic repulsion. And so this whole thing forms a composite object. But I have that second condition because a reviewer pointed out that there might be objects that are temporarily contained within the spatial area surrounded by the boundary, but are not contained by it in the sense that they are not forming a bound state because they're just passing through. So an example might be some high energy particles that just pass through our bodies and might at one particular moment be located inside us, but they're not actually forming a bound state, so they're not part of the organism. But anything else, so things that are ordinarily located inside and form a bound state with the other parts of the organism are parts of the organism. So, on the living objects view, organisms can have other organisms as parts, as long as both are living composite objects and one is contained within the other and forms a bound state with its parts. So cells in multicellular organisms are also organisms, and they're parts of an organism. Both cells and zooids in colonial organisms are also organisms that are parts of other organisms. And in the same way, we can think of fetuses within a pregnant organism as organisms, and their cells as well, as organisms that are part of another organism. So far, this speaks in favor of the Parthood view. Now, there are 2 points on which I am going to slightly disagree with Kingman's view. So one is the question of boundaries, and the other one is the question of metabolism. So is the boundary between developing organism and the maternal organism just a fiat boundary? I don't think that that's the case. I think that even in species that have a high degree of physiological integration, like humans, who have these very invasive hemocorial placentas, the fusion between the mother and fetus is not complete. There is, in fact, always a boundary at the maternal-fetal interface, across which the fetus is able to selectively exchange matter and obtain free energy, so as to maintain itself in a state of thermodynamic disequilibrium, which makes it a living object. So although fetal tissue does come into direct contact with maternal blood, the interface is limited by a boundary, which is especially the syncytial trophoblast. So I'm going to, which functions as a semi-permeable boundary for exchange of nutrients and waste products. In fact, there are two boundaries. There are two, interfaces between the fetus and the maternal organism, but the syncytial trophoblast is the main one. So at the blood syncytial trophoblast interface, maternal blood is separated from fetal blood by this syncytial trophoblast, which is a syncytium, so it's made of fused cells, which functions particularly well as a boundary because it doesn't have any, so some cells are able, when you have just a layer of cells that is dividing two things, there are some things, some pathogens and some immune cells that are able to squeeze through the cells. Whereas if you have a layer of fused cells, there are no intercellular gaps. So there's no way for any cells to squeeze through. And this layer also has some really interesting biophysical properties. It has high elasticity, it resists physical deformation, and it forms this boundary. There's another interface at the uterine trophoblast interface, which is where trophoblasts invade the uterus. And here, there are obviously some trophoblasts that are just separate from this and just embedded in the uterus. But this mass of trophoblasts plus the basement membrane underneath also form a physical barrier between the mother and fetus. Now about metabolism. Kingma also argues that the foster relies on the rest of the gravida for many of its important physiological functions, including the extraction of oxygen, digestion, temperature regulation, and waste disposal. And while that is no doubt true, it's also true that the fetus exchanges oxygen, nutrients, and waste products with the maternal environment at this maternal-fetal interface. And it actively transports oxygen and nutrients to its cells and waste products away from them using its own cardiovascular system. In fact, fetal metabolism can be distinguished from the mother's. For example, fetuses express a hemoglobin gene that confer higher oxygen affinity, which facilitates placental oxygen transfer. Now, it's true that the fetus does not engage in digestion or temperature regulation, but then again, neither do many other organisms. So, for example, there are lots of gastrointestinal parasites that have no need to do any digestion because they just absorb pre-digested nutrients. And of course, perhaps most organisms are ectothermic. So there's no reason why we can't say the fetus is ectothermic and then acquires endothermy after birth. Now, the comparison with parasites is not accidental. In fact, some biologists conceive of pregnancy as a specialized form of interspecies parasitism. But I think that this is only problematic on views according to which parasites cannot be part of the host, but on the living object's view they can, as long as they are contained inside it and form a bound state with its other parts. Which I think is an advantage of the view because in many cases, there isn't a clear dividing line between an organism that is inside another, that is beneficial to it, or detrimental, or somewhat beneficial and somewhat detrimental. It's really unclear. But all of these speak to the fetus being an organism, but they don't speak against parthood. So, is the fetus contained within the boundary of the pregnant organism? Well, yes, it is. And here I completely agree with Kingma when she says that the fetus is contained within the internal environment of the gravida. And in fact, even if one thinks that the uterine cavity is not part of the internal environment, the foster would still be, because post-implantation, it doesn't just reside within the uterine cavity, it is actually implanted in the uterine wall. But of course, the uterine cavity is actually part of the internal environment of the organism. In fact, I also think that is also the case for the environment within the digestive tract, unlike what Smith and Brogard think. But I agree that there might be some vagueness as to where exactly the boundary is drawn. So, on the living objects view, the fetus is part of the living object that is the maternal organism, because it is contained within its boundary and forms a chain of bound states with its other parts. Now, to be clear, this is a Parthood view, and we should reject the containment view as stated, because the fetus is not merely contained within the maternal organism, but it is contained within the boundary of the maternal organism. And in fact, the containment partly explains the Parthood relation. And because of this, I think that this is not just going to be the case for organisms that are highly physiologically integrated and topologically connected during development to the maternal organism, but it can be extended to any developing organisms that are contained within the pregnant organism and form chains of bound states with its other parts. Like, for example, aplacental viviparous species. This is such as not the shark I showed earlier, but some sharks that are not connected through an umbilical cord and a placenta, but can swim freely within the uterus. And in fact, this one can actually swim from one uterus to the other. Or the male pregnancy of seahorses, or other kinds of internal development. And that's it. Thank you.
Just your yeah, got all your hands. Oh, crystal night is. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Bart, just you can.
Bart.
Yes.
I'm making it very easy.
Okay, so yeah, thank you very much for the very interesting talk. And I can see where you are really coming from, in terms of like the relationship between the fetus and the mothers. But I would just like to understand better how you see this narrative translated into the individuality. So do you see a pregnant, let's say, individual, or pregnant female, as one individual or two individuals? And then, and this is also somehow related to this first question, do you see that this containment view and Parthood view as both accurate at the same time? So can we say, for example, about the fetus that it's contained, but it's part at the same time, or you think that depending on the definition of containment or Parthood, we can choose different perspectives? So, for example, there is a sense in which a fetus is part of the mother's body. There is a sense in which it is a kind of contained, self-contained sort of entity. So is it like, do you think about it at the same time, or you think that it depends on the definition? And then if it depends on the definition, how do you think that, how like adaptation of this definition for our, I don't know, some kind of explanatory purposes might be relevant? Because in different contexts, we may choose to look at, for example, fetus as a kind of contained entity, in another context as a part of the mother's body. Which, depending on the some kind of explanatory needs, maybe adopted in given circumstances. So I'd just like to understand, like, do you think, like, ontologically that, if you translate it into the problem of individuality, we are dealing here with one and two individuals at the same time? Yeah, is my question, or how do you see?
Okay, thank you. So, first of all, I see the question, so, Samira Kasha has this paper about how we should really distinguish between biological individual is not a sortal. You have to ask what kind of biological individual. So I think that the relevant question is organism is the relevant biological individual that we need to talk about. Are there one or two? Well, that depends on when exactly the developing organism comes into existence as an organism. So if let's assume that Smith and Brogard are right, and we begin to exist at gastrulation or some other time during development. Well, before then, you have exactly one multicellular organism, which is the maternal organism, and you also have a bunch of cells. You have a lot of cells. You have all the cells that compose the maternal organism, and then you have some cells that are part of an embryo that is not yet a multicellular organism. And then as soon as you do have a multicellular organism, then you have two biological individuals, more specifically organisms, multicellular ones, plus all the cells, and one of them is a part of another. That's the now, is containment and parthood, are they both true? So, like I said, I'm only rejecting the containment view insofar as I'm rejecting the view that the fetus is merely contained. So, in that sense, my view is a parthood view. But it is also a containment view, although not as stated, because it is essential to the parthood that the fetus is actually contained within the boundary of the pregnant organism. Now, it's true that for some purposes, we might want to think about other kinds of parthood that are not just about ontology. So in some cases, we might be interested in whether some material parts of an organism are also functional parts. And we might have other notions of parthood, and I'm okay with that, but I'm only concerned with what organisms there are and with material parthood.
I'm just gonna turn this on. OMG. Okay. So I know that, you know, when you're writing philosophical argument, you have to start somewhere. But your argument rests on so many controversial claims, right? So as plausible as the bound state solution to the special composition question might be, it's not universally accepted.
Yeah.
It's not, it may not even be widely accepted, right? And so that's one. In the parthood debate, in the bump kind of metaphysics of pregnancy debate, parthood and containment are generally taken to be mutually exclusive. So you can't be both part and contained by unless you change the definition of containment, in which case we need a kind of axiomatized mereology in which that can occur. Or you're just changing the terms of the debate, and then we're no longer debating with you, right? So there's a dialectical failure if you pick so many controversial positions that we no longer know who we are arguing with.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's it.
That's really, so the basic view is not widely accepted. Yes, I know, I'm trying to promote it. So my view rests on the bound state view and I endorse it. I think it's the most promising answer to the special composition question. I have not seen any answer that is remotely as promising as this one. I'm not sure it's, so it might not be fully developed yet. It might not be widely accepted yet, but I am fairly confident that it's a really promising one because it's naturalistic, because it's based on a physical concept, because it's based on a real physical difference between things that form bound states and things that don't, which is a difference that can be quantified in terms of energy. So it's not plucked out of thin air. And I agree with you that Parthood and containment views are taken to be in opposition, which is why I said specifically, my view is a Parthood view. I am rejecting the containment view as stated. So I am rejecting the view that the fetus is merely contained within the pregnant organism. Yeah, my view is a Parthood view. The fetus is part of the pregnant organism. I am just pointing out that this part of the view involves a kind of containment, which is not the same kind of containment, granted, as the containment in the containment view. Instead, it is a kind of containment that involves the notion of being spatially located within a boundary and forming a bound state with the other parts.
But this is, I think, that every advocate of the Parthood view would agree.
Great.
Because you cannot deny that, you know, your parts are somehow contained in the body. But this is not what I think that containment view is saying.
Yeah.
Containment view is really saying that fetus is contained in the body, but as a kind of independent individual, or as a kind of, you know, separate kind of entity. So that's, I think, where the controversy lies. So if you were saying that, oh, I also believe in a containment view, it's not in the same sense in which most people would advocate. And this is a non-controversial thing. And I don't think there's anybody virtual in the world who will deny that our parts are contained within our bodies, because this is what being a part means. It's something more. So containment is a kind of shortcut for kind of stance in the individuality debate about pregnancy. So that's why I was asking you how you see the problem of individuality here, because being an advocate of a containment view means something more than just saying that it's contained, but just a label with some, you know, more elaborate concept, which says that it needs to be encapsulated like a kind of yogurt in a fridge or something like that. So this is something that you deny. I think that this is.
Yeah, so, but I would dispute that everyone agrees that a part needs to be contained within. Some people would argue that
But you may have a part.
that you may have a
separated.
part that is separate from you, yeah. Some people would argue that. I don't think that that's the case, but I think that's.
It's part of the same set.
Yeah.
But they are
Yeah, so
contained-
on the bound state view, there are two separates.
or
That's
different
one of the examples of.
collection of part of the contained within a kind of population. But even if it's a loose kind of topological association between these entities, there is a sense in which they are contained in some kind of space.
So I don't think we disagree.
Let's suggest that, right? Please.
Thank you for the great talk. I find it, yeah, quite convincing. I just have a curiosity, because you didn't mention the speaking process view in his account, so it seems a bit as a contrast is like part versus containment. And I think that what Anne-Sophie wants to do is just to come in and basically the account. So I wonder whether I have any thoughts of how that would be compatible with what you say, or whether that would ask us to completely revise the view of object and point them. there is no dialogue.
Yeah, I'm not really sure what to think of Anne-Sophie's view. So I think that it's definitely true that there isn't a point in time at which life begins, other than far into the past. So life began exactly once, as far as we know, almost 4 billion years ago, and everything since is just a continuation of life processes. Now, when, for example, a cell splits in two, we normally think that, especially if it divides more or less symmetrically, we think that the cell ceases to exist when it completes its division, and now there are two cells. So, and there is a continuation of life processes, and you can actually imagine some life processes going on this end of the cell and then continuing to occur, but now on what we within what we think is a numerically different cell. So I think it's really tricky to individuate processes, and it's less tricky to individuate objects. But I think that what we actually need is to individuate objects, and then the processes of life are just those that occur within this particular object, and that allow this object to be a living one. Yeah, but I'm not sure I have anything more interesting to say about that.
Yeah, just there I was thinking that maybe what one could say that then pregnancy is a process within this object. So in a way, you can use some of the advantages of earlier by saying, well, yes, there is a process of pregnancy, there's a process that happens within objects that or that involve objects that have a kind of level of promise.
Cool. Yes. But here I think that pregnancy is a process that is a process of the pregnant organism. Whereas development is the process that is taking place within the developing organism. Even though obviously the pregnancy involves the relation between two.
Chris is next on the list online. I don't know if you can hear this.
Hi, yeah, can you hear me?
Unmute yourself, Chris.
I'll try with no headphones.
Wait, I'm
Okay.
muted.
Go
Am I
again,
supposed to be
Chris.
muted?
Can you hear me?
No, nope, that was not it.
Okay.
Margarida, you definitely need to be.
I need to be muted. Okay, sorry.
Can it be the volume because you put it down
Could
on
be.
the down video? If you just
I
press
can
the
hear you.
button,
Okay, how about now?
Can you hear
and
me?
now I'll make your audio again.
Can you hear me?
I'm
No,
muted,
the
but
audio button on Zoom.
I'm supposed to be muted.
Shall I?
I unmute my audio? Okay.
Okay, Chris.
Can you hear me?
Nope,
No.
we can't.
My worry is that.
Oh, and they can hear Chris fine.
Yeah, it's because
Oh.
it's going through your laptop, so.
That's helpful, Amber.
Okay.
Thanks, Amber.
That's weird.
Margarida,
Everything
just
you're
unplug
right.
the HDMI if you have camera slides anymore.
Shall I just write it in the chat?
Speak confident.
Are you sure?
I still have them here, don't worry.
What will we do
Okay.
about
Do I speak or shall I? Right.
Hi, Chris. Can hear you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I will try and be brief. Margarida, there were two special composition questions in Peter van Inwagen's book. The inverse special composition question asks which objects are composite, and they ask for a function of the y So Y is a living organism or Y is a composite object of some sort. The one that Peter van Inwagen proposed to answer correctly was the special composition question, which can't refer to the Y. I wonder if you might think that you might be answering a different question. Because if you think you're answering the first special composition question, there are 4 problems for the bound state answer. As I've said before, it's formally incorrect because it appeals to the system composed of the X's. It's effectively circular because of that. It's materially inadequate because it violates the transitivity of parthood and proper parthood. And it's finally irrelevant because it's defined in terms of higher order conceptions. So I just wonder if you might be asking a different question than you perhaps think you are.
Second problem with it. The first one is this is formally incorrect because it appeals to the system composed of the X's. The second one was?
It's effectively trivial for that same reason. It's the third is it's materially inadequate because it violates the transitivity of parthood in terms of which all these relations are defined. And it's finally irrelevant because it's on a categorically different notion. Yeah, so I mean, hopefully this will get published one day, but I think you heard that talk. I just wondered if you've got any thoughts on that.
That's really good, thanks. So I'm not really a specialist on the bound state view, but when I refer to a system composed of the X's, a physical system composed of the X's, please read that as a physical system that is so a physical system can be defined without appealing to composition. I just mean a physical system of the X's. I am not assuming composition. So the X's compose something when a system of the X's has this and that property, not when a system that is already composed of the object of the X's in the sense that it is already composite.
So I
the
mean,
problem-
we can
not-
talk further about this, but that's one of many problems. But that's
a
the
physical
view
system-
as stated says it's composed of, and if that's in a non-mereological sense,
yeah.
then that's fine. But it's not at all helpful to just, in my view. But we can talk
I
further.
can see how that might be confusing. Yeah, maybe I shouldn't have said composed of the X's. Yeah, thanks. That's actually really helpful. I should revise the formulation to make sure.
The problem comes, it iterates because the notion of a bound state is defined with respect to the frame of reference where the center is defined as the system that is at rest.
Yes, that's right. But you can, but that system does not assume composition. So you can define a physical state. You can define a frame of reference relative to A, B, and C, where A, B, and C compose exactly nothing. So I don't think that that's a problem, but I might have to revise how I formulated it. I agree with you that it violates transitivity. Vector and Ladyman admit that it does, and they're okay with it. I think I'm also okay with it. There's a different version of the bound state view, which is Mackenzie and Moore's formulation of it, which does not violate transitivity. But I forget what exactly the difference is with their view. But yeah, I agree that there's probably that the bound state view probably needs some work. But I'm not sure I'm the ideal person to do it. So I'm just going to assume that it's right and use it for my own purposes.
Fine. And all the best with the metabolic stuff. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm not sure I reckon I can squeeze in one question.
I was just kind of.
Oh, no, you say it. Just grab the. Yeah, thanks, Margarida. I really enjoy that. And I'm really glad that you're having a shot at bringing the special composition question or an answer to the special composition question, like in direct dialogue with the metaphysical pregnancy, because obviously that's something that lots of people quite rightly pointed out that, I just like, guys, there's just organisms. I'm not going to worry about how to solve that. And, that is a bit of a, I don't think it's totally illegitimate, but it's certainly legitimate to think, well, so I really like that. However difficult it may be. I was curious about the boundaries. So obviously that whole boundary discussion I had, on the one hand, is in direct response to Smith and Brogard, who have a very specific definition of boundary. They have a distinction between fiat and bona fide, it's theirs as far as but. So I don't know, when you say there is a boundary, whether you're exactly working with their view of boundaries and with their view of the distinctions between fiat boundaries and bona fide boundaries. But I guess my question or concern about what you were proposing, there's a couple of ways of formulating it, but one of it is to think that obviously you can drill into any bit of tissue and say, here's a cell that I mark as fetal origin, and here's a cell that I mark as maternal origin. And they're boundaries, right? As far as I know, there's no syncytium cells that are composed of fetal and maternal cells, because cells are pretty cells of good integrity, right? Cells have boundaries. They have good boundaries. They're called membranes. And we can pick them out, except when they fuse. Exactly. Well, then they fuse into larger cells. Or when they start to break down, or they're phagocytosed or whatever, but then they break down, so they're kind of no longer a cell. So yes, you can drill into any tissue and say, here's a fetal origin cell, here's a maternal origin cell. You can look in blood and say, here's a cell floating around, it's a maternal origin cell, and here's a cell floating around that is a fetal origin cell. And I am the graduate of many episodes of being a gravida, and supposedly I will have in my body in all sorts of places fetal cells from each of, well, is it from each of my children? Anyway, each of the pregnancies that resulted in, who knows, many other pregnancies I was never aware of, miscarriages. But to say that for every individual cell you can say is a fetal origin cell or is a maternal origin is not exactly the same as saying here's a boundary between a composite organism composed of cells. And the way you sketch this, it sounded like you were dragging a whole bunch of maternal cells effectively into the fetus, right? Because you said, look, we've got at the anchoring syncytiotrophoblasts, right? So that in the end hooks or grows, or if you want, the placenta fetus into the maternal organism, into the decidua, makes this very complicated tree-like structures, modifies blood vessels, colonizes the blood vessels, displaces maternal cells, intermingles with them in some cases. You were like, oh, well, that in the basal plate, a lot of which is maternal origin cell, is all fetus, and then there's the boundary. Did I understand that correctly? Does that mean, there's a question there. Did I understand it correctly? Does it mean that the fetus incorporates a whole bunch of maternal origin cells into its placenta? And does that then also mean that those are not part of the maternal organism anymore?
Okay, so firstly, they're all part of the maternal organism because all the fetal cells are also part of the maternal organism. And secondly, I am not basing my distinction on maternal cells versus fetal cells at all. So I agree that you probably have as parts of an organism some cells that are of fetal origin. And just as I also think that we have some bacteria in our guts that is of different origin than ourselves, and that is perfectly fine and perfectly acceptable. And I also don't see a problem with the fetus possibly having cells of maternal origin as parts. I am not thinking of boundaries in exactly the same terms as Smith and Brogard. But so I'm thinking of boundaries, well, like I kind of am in the sense that I am arguing that these are real bona fide boundaries and not just fiat boundaries. And the reason I think that is because they are physical boundaries, physical structures, and these physical structures are semi-permeable, and it is across these semi-permeable structures that the fetus is able to exchange nutrients with what, from its perspective, is the external environment, which is the internal environment of the maternal organism. So because there is a physical structure that separates it from the rest of the maternal environment, and it is able to do these metabolic exchanges across this boundary, that is what I think makes it a real boundary and makes the fetus an organism. But it does not at all prevent it from being a part of the maternal organism. And the origin of the cells is not really what matters there.
Thank you, that's really helpful. I think it's my fault that it wrong. I think it's my slide. Please join me in thanking Margarida.